You're sitting in a coffee shop, and you overhear someone at the next table talking about how the government is secretly conducting mind control experiments. Your first instinct is probably to smile politely and maybe move to another seat. After all, that's classic conspiracy theory territory, right? The kind of thing that gets relegated to late-night radio shows and internet forums where people also discuss UFOs and the Illuminati. Except, what if I told you that one was actually true? Documented, admitted, with thousands of pages of declassified proof. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore the fascinating, sometimes unsettling stories that shape our understanding of the world. Tonight, we're exploring something that challenges how we think about truth and power, conspiracy theories that turned out to be real. We'll discover 10 stories where the people asking uncomfortable questions, the ones dismissed as paranoid or delusional, were actually right all along, where what seemed like far-fetched conspiracy thinking was actually just accurate reporting of things that powerful institutions desperately wanted to keep hidden. So settle into your most comfortable position, let the tension of the day drift away, and join me as we explore these fascinating stories of hidden truth coming to light. Let's begin with perhaps the most infamous of all proven conspiracies, a program so dystopian it sounds like science fiction. Imagine walking into a hospital for routine treatment and unknowingly becoming part of an experiment to fracture your mind and rebuild it under someone else's control. Imagine your government dosing you with powerful hallucinogens without your knowledge or consent, watching to see how it affects your behavior, your relationships, your grip on reality itself. This sounds like the plot of a paranoid thriller, the fever dream of someone who trusts institutions far too little. Except it happened. For over 2 decades, it happened to thousands of people. The conspiracy theory was this: the CIA was conducting illegal experiments on unwitting American and Canadian citizens, trying to develop techniques for mind control and behavior modification. They were using LSD, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, and experimental techniques that violated every ethical standard of medical practice. People who made these claims in the 1960s and early 70s were dismissed as anti-government radicals, paranoid hippies seeing CIA agents in every shadow. Then, in 1975, the Church Committee investigations and a commission led by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller began examining intelligence agency abuses. What they uncovered was MKUltra, and the reality was somehow worse than the conspiracy theories suggested. MKUltra began in 1953, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles. The program's goal was straightforward in its horror: develop techniques to control human behavior, to create programmable agents, to break down individual will and rebuild it according to CIA specifications. The context was the Cold War, and American intelligence was convinced that communist nations had developed advanced brainwashing techniques. The response wasn't to hold firm to American values of individual liberty and human dignity. The response was to fight fire with fire, to develop their own capacity for mind control. The program was vast. At least 80 institutions participated, including 44 colleges and universities, 15 research foundations, 12 hospitals, and 3 prisons. Many of these institutions had no idea they were part of a CIA program. The agency funneled money through front organizations with innocuous names. Researchers who thought they were conducting legitimate academic studies were actually feeding data into a classified program for weaponizing psychology. The heart of MKUltra was a simple, terrible question. How do you break a human mind? How do you shatter someone's sense of self so completely that you can reshape them? The program explored every avenue. They tested LSD extensively, dosing unwitting subjects to observe the effects. CIA operatives dosed each other at office parties as a kind of twisted game. They dosed mental patients, prisoners, and ordinary citizens. They established safe houses where prostitutes would lure men for the CIA to observe the effects of drugs administered without consent. One of the most notorious subprojects involved Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute. Cameron, a respected psychiatrist who had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, received CIA funding for experiments he called psychic driving. His techniques were brutal in their thoroughness. Patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time. They were subjected to electroshock therapy at levels far beyond standard practice. They were forced to listen to recorded messages repeated hundreds of thousands of times. Simple statements like, "You are a good wife and mother," played on loops while patients lay semi-conscious. Cameron believed he could erase existing patterns of behavior and implant new ones. He called this depatterning and psychic driving. What he actually did was destroy people. Patients who entered his program with relatively minor issues like postpartum depression or anxiety emerged unable to recognize their families, unable to remember their own identities, reduced to infantile states where they couldn't control their bodily functions. The CIA funded this destruction of human minds because it might yield insights into control techniques. The scope of MKUltra's experiments defied belief. They tested sensory deprivation, confining people in isolation chambers where they were cut off from all stimulation. They explored hypnosis as a tool for creating programmable agents. They investigated whether they could erase memories or create false ones. They examined whether certain drugs could make people more suggestible, more compliant, more willing to betray their own values and beliefs. Frank Olson's story represents perhaps the most famous MKUltra casualty. Olson was a biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division, which developed biological weapons. In November 1953, at a CIA retreat, Olson was given LSD without his knowledge. He had a severe psychological reaction. Days later, he plunged from a hotel window in New York, dying on impact. For decades, his death was ruled a suicide. His family was told he'd had a nervous breakdown. They received a government settlement and apology in 1975 when MKUltra became public, along with the admission that he'd been dosed with LSD. But the story didn't end there. In 1994, Olson's body was exhumed. A forensic pathologist found evidence suggesting he'd been struck on the head before going out the window. The trajectory of his fall suggested he might have been pushed. New evidence emerged suggesting Olson had raised ethical concerns about the biological warfare program and might have been planning to leave. Whether his death was murder or LSD-induced psychosis, the CIA had created the conditions that killed him. The true scale of MKUltra may never be known. In 1973, as the program was ending and investigations were beginning, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. Most documents were shredded, burned, lost to history. What we know comes from the roughly 20,000 documents that survived because they'd been misfiled in a financial records building. These surviving papers provided undeniable proof of the program's existence and scope, but they represent only a fragment of the full story. The revelations created shockwaves. Congressional hearings in 1977 brought CIA officers and former directors to testify. Admiral Stansfield Turner, then CIA director, admitted the program's existence and apologized for its abuses. Victims and their families filed lawsuits. Some received settlements, though no amount of money could restore destroyed minds or lost years. The Canadian government eventually compensated Cameron's victims, acknowledging that their intelligence service had been complicit. MKUltra's legacy extends far beyond its victims. It fundamentally changed how Americans viewed their government. The revelation that intelligence agencies had conducted medical experiments on unwitting citizens, violating the Nuremberg Code established after Nazi war crimes, shattered assumptions about American exceptionalism. If the CIA could do this, drug citizens, torture patients, destroy minds in the name of national security, what else might they be capable of? The conspiracy theorists who'd claimed the government was experimenting on people had been right. Not metaphorically right, not approximately right, but precisely, documentedly right. The paranoid vision of a government agency treating citizens as expendable test subjects in pursuit of mind control wasn't paranoia at all. It was accurate reporting of classified truth. MKUltra also raises uncomfortable questions that persist today. The program officially ended in the 1970s, but can we be certain? The CIA destroyed most evidence of what they'd done. Intelligence agencies operate in secrecy by nature. When trust is broken this completely, how is it restored? When an institution proves willing to violate fundamental human rights in the name of security, what reassurances can they offer that would be believable? The scientific legacy of MKUltra is equally troubling. Some of the research conducted under the program ended up published in academic journals, stripped of its CIA origins. Knowledge gained through torture and non-consensual experimentation entered the broader body of psychological research. How do we grapple with knowledge obtained unethically? Can it be used, or is it forever tainted by its origins? For the people who lived through it, these philosophical questions matter less than the personal devastation. Lives were destroyed, families torn apart, minds broken beyond repair. The conspiracy theory was proven true, justice was partially served, but the damage was permanent. The victims of MKUltra received acknowledgement, but rarely restitution, that matched their suffering. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service launched a study in Macon County, Alabama, that would run for 40 years and become perhaps the most infamous medical ethics violation in American history. The study's full name was Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. That word, untreated, should immediately raise questions, but it would take 4 decades before those questions would be asked loudly enough to end the study. The conspiracy theory went like this. The government was deliberately letting black men die from syphilis, studying the disease's progression rather than treating it, telling participants they were receiving medical care while actually denying them effective treatment. People who raised concerns were dismissed. After all, this was a public health service study conducted by doctors, overseen by medical professionals. Surely accusations of deliberate medical neglect were exaggerations, misunderstandings of complex medical research. Except they weren't. The Tuskegee Study was exactly what critics claimed: a deliberate, systematic denial of treatment to 399 black men with syphilis, observed over decades as the disease ravaged their bodies, their families, and their communities. It was medical racism codified as research, and it operated in plain sight for 40 years. The study began in the depths of the Great Depression in one of America's poorest regions. Macon County had the highest syphilis rate in the nation, a consequence of poverty, lack of health care access, and the lingering effects of slavery and Jim Crow oppression. The Public Health Service, in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute, recruited 600 black men, 399 with latent syphilis and 201 without the disease to serve as controls. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that encompassed various ailments including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. They were offered free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. For men living in crushing poverty with no access to health care, this seemed like a blessing. They trusted the doctors from Tuskegee Institute. They believed they were receiving treatment. They weren't. The entire point of the study was to observe untreated syphilis. The researchers wanted to document what happened when the disease progressed without intervention. They wanted to compare syphilis progression in black men to similar studies done on white men in Norway. The racist assumption underlying the entire project was that syphilis might affect black people differently than white people, that racial differences might alter disease progression. In 1932, when the study began, treatment for syphilis existed but was dangerous and only partially effective. Treatments included heavy metals like arsenic and bismuth, which were toxic and difficult to administer. But by the 1940s, penicillin had been discovered and proven highly effective against syphilis. This was a game-changing breakthrough. Syphilis, which had been a death sentence or at least a guarantee of serious disability, could now be cured with a simple course of antibiotics. The Tuskegee researchers knew this. They watched as penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis. They saw dramatic declines in syphilis mortality and morbidity as the antibiotic became widely available, and they decided not to treat their subjects. More than that, they actively prevented the men from receiving treatment elsewhere. When World War II draft physicals revealed some participants had syphilis and military doctors tried to treat them, the researchers intervened to ensure the men remained untreated. The researchers excluded the men from syphilis treatment programs in Macon County. They convinced local doctors not to treat study participants. This wasn't passive observation. This was active prevention of treatment. The researchers needed their untreated subjects to remain untreated, even as effective treatment became available, even as the men's health deteriorated, even as they infected their wives and passed congenital syphilis to their children. The progression of untreated syphilis is horrible. The disease moves through stages. Primary syphilis begins with a painless sore at the infection site. Secondary syphilis brings rashes, fever, and systemic symptoms. Then comes a latent period where symptoms disappear, but the infection continues damaging internal organs. Finally, tertiary syphilis emerges. Tumors, cardiovascular damage, and neurosyphilis that causes blindness, paralysis, dementia, and death. The Tuskegee researchers documented all of this. They watched men go blind, lose control of their limbs, descend into dementia. They performed spinal taps, telling participants these were special treatments when they were actually just collecting data. They followed participants for years, decades, watching disease progression without intervention. The men trusted the doctors. Many viewed the study as a blessing, a rare instance of medical attention in a place where black people had virtually no access to health care. They attended checkups regularly. They brought their friends and family members to the clinic. They believed they were being cared for. They didn't know they were being observed like laboratory specimens while a treatable disease destroyed their bodies. For 40 years, the study continued. Dozens of men died directly from syphilis and its complications. Wives contracted the disease from their infected husbands. Children were born with congenital syphilis, facing developmental disabilities and health problems from birth. The researchers knew this was happening. They documented it. They published papers in medical journals about their findings. The study operated openly, with medical professionals across the country aware of its existence. How did this happen? How did hundreds of doctors, nurses, and public health officials participate in or ignore a study that deliberately denied treatment to dying men? The answer lies in the racism that permeated American medicine and society. The men in the study weren't seen as fully human, weren't granted the same moral consideration as white patients. Medical ethics that would have immediately ended a study on white men didn't apply to black men in rural Alabama. The study might have continued indefinitely if not for Peter Buxton, a public health service investigator who learned about the study in 1966. Buxton was disturbed by what he discovered and raised ethical concerns with his superiors. He was told the study was important, that it needed to continue until all subjects had died and autopsies could be performed. When internal complaints went nowhere, Buxton went to the press. In 1972, Jean Heller broke the story for the Associated Press. The article was titled, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." The revelation caused national outrage. How could American doctors have done this? How could a study this unethical have operated for decades with government funding and medical community approval? The study was immediately terminated. Congressional hearings followed. An ad hoc advisory panel reviewed the study and condemned it as ethically unjustified. The panel's report stated clearly that participants had been exploited and misled, that the study should have ended when penicillin became available in the 1940s at the latest, and that the entire project violated basic principles of medical ethics. The government eventually settled a class action lawsuit filed by survivors and families, providing lifetime medical benefits and burial services to participants and their families. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the U.S. government. Standing with survivors, Clinton said, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." The Tuskegee Study's legacy extends far beyond its immediate victims. It shattered trust between Black Americans and the medical establishment, creating justified suspicion that persists today. When health disparities between Black and white Americans are discussed, when vaccine hesitancy is higher in Black communities, when medical research struggles to recruit Black participants, Tuskegee's shadow looms large. The study proved that racism in medicine could be institutionalized, systematic, and deadly. The revelation also led to fundamental changes in how medical research is conducted. The study was one of the primary motivations for the National Research Act of 1974, which established institutional review boards to review human subject research. The Belmont Report, published in 1979, established ethical principles for research with human subjects: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Informed consent became not just good practice, but legal requirement. Yet questions remain. How many other unethical studies were conducted that we don't know about? How much damage was done before ethical standards were established? And are we certain that similar abuses couldn't happen again? The Tuskegee Study didn't occur in some distant past. It continued until 1972, well within living memory. Many survivors were still alive when Clinton apologized in 1997. Some are alive today. In the 1960s and 70s, civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and political organizers noticed strange things happening. Mail would arrive opened and resealed. Phones would make odd clicking sounds. Movement leaders would suddenly face criminal charges on what seemed like flimsy evidence. Activists would receive anonymous letters designed to create suspicion and discord within organizations. People would show up at meetings who seemed just a little too eager, a little too interested in pushing toward violence, a little too knowledgeable about things they shouldn't know. When activists claimed they were being systematically surveilled, infiltrated, and sabotaged by federal law enforcement, they were called paranoid. The FBI insisted it was simply investigating potential criminal activity, that any monitoring was justified by legitimate security concerns. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who claimed they were targets of government harassment, were dismissed as self-important or paranoid. They weren't paranoid, they were correct. The FBI was indeed conducting a massive, illegal campaign to surveil, infiltrate, discredit, and destroy organizations and individuals deemed subversive. The program was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, and it represented one of the most extensive violations of civil liberties in American history. COINTELPRO actually began in 1956, initially focused on the Communist Party USA. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, obsessed with the threat of communism, and convinced that domestic dissent was often communist-inspired, authorized covert action programs to disrupt organizations he deemed subversive. But the program expanded dramatically in the 1960s to target civil rights organizations. The Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, anti-Vietnam War groups, and even individuals whose only crime was criticism of government policy. The program's tactics were breathtaking in their cynicism and illegality. The FBI didn't just observe and document. They actively worked to destroy organizations and individuals through psychological warfare, character assassination, infiltration, and provocation. Let's understand what this meant in practice. Surveillance was extensive and warrantless. The FBI tapped phones, bugged homes and offices, opened mail, and maintained constant physical surveillance of targeted individuals. FBI informants infiltrated organizations, sometimes rising to leadership positions where they could influence strategy and direction. In many cases, the most militant voices pushing for violence were actually FBI informants or agents provocateurs, deliberately trying to steer movements toward illegal actions that would justify arrest and prosecution. The FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. exemplifies COINTELPRO's malicious creativity. The Bureau considered King one of the most dangerous men in America, not because he advocated violence. He explicitly didn't, but because his nonviolent resistance movement was effectively challenging segregation and mobilizing mass support. Hoover personally detested King and authorized extensive surveillance and harassment. The FBI tapped King's phones and hotel rooms, recording his conversations and private moments. They compiled information about his extramarital affairs. Then they sent King an anonymous letter accompanied by recordings that was clearly intended to push him toward suicide. The letter called King a fraud and an evil, abnormal beast. It said, "There is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you." The FBI sent this suicide note to a Nobel Peace Prize winner because he was effectively advocating for civil rights. The FBI's war against the Black Panther Party was even more violent and destructive. While the Panthers had genuine problems, including members who committed crimes, many of their programs, like free breakfast for children and community health clinics, were clearly legal and beneficial. The FBI didn't distinguish. Hoover called the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country and authorized COINTELPRO to destroy them by any means necessary. FBI infiltrators provoked conflicts between the Panthers and other Black organizations. Anonymous letters were sent to gang leaders, falsely claiming the Panthers had marked them for death, hoping to trigger violent retaliation. The Bureau worked with local police to raid Panther offices, seizing equipment and arresting leaders on various charges. In some cases, FBI actions contributed to deaths. The most controversial case involved Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. Hampton was an effective organizer who was building coalitions between different radical groups. In December 1969, Chicago police raided Hampton's apartment in a pre-dawn assault, killing Hampton and another Panther, Mark Clark. The police claimed they'd been fired upon and returned fire. Later investigation revealed that police had fired between 82 and 99 shots, while Panthers had fired exactly one shot. Likely a reflexive trigger pull, as Clark was killed. Years later, documents revealed that the FBI had been surveilling Hampton extensively, that an FBI informant had provided authorities with a detailed floor plan of the apartment, and that Hampton had been drugged by the informant the night before the raid. While the FBI didn't pull the triggers, their intelligence made the raid possible. A federal investigation concluded that law enforcement had conspired to deny Hampton and other Panthers their civil rights. COINTELPRO tactics extended to creating fictional documents and media. The FBI forged letters designed to break up marriages, create suspicion between allies, and make activists appear violent or unreasonable. They planted false stories in newspapers. They created fake organizations that claimed to represent particular movements but actually worked to discredit them. They sent anonymous communications warning activists that their comrades were FBI informants. Sometimes true, often false, always intended to create paranoia and dysfunction. The program worked to deny employment to activists by contacting employers and sharing information designed to make the person seem unreliable or dangerous. They worked to get activists expelled from universities. They pressured landlords to evict targeted individuals. The goal was to make activism so costly in personal and professional terms that people would give up. We know about COINTELPRO because in 1971, a group of activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole thousands of documents and began distributing them to journalists and politicians. Among the documents were papers detailing COINTELPRO operations, providing the first documentary evidence that the FBI's abuses were systematic rather than isolated incidents. The revelations sparked outrage and investigations. The Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, conducted extensive hearings on intelligence agency abuses in 1975. Their final report documented the scope of COINTELPRO and concluded that the FBI had repeatedly violated constitutional rights, exceeded its mandate, and used tactics that had no conceivable rational relationship to legitimate law enforcement. The committee found that many FBI actions were taken because of the ideas expressed by the targets, not because of any harm which might flow from those ideas. COINTELPRO was officially discontinued in 1971 after the media break-in exposed it. But questions remain about whether similar programs continued under different names or through different mechanisms. The FBI's treatment of activists during the Black Lives Matter movement has raised concerns that COINTELPRO's spirit lives on, adapted to new technologies and new threats to the status quo. The program's exposure vindicated activists who'd been labeled paranoid for claiming government harassment. They weren't imagining things. The FBI really was reading their mail, tapping their phones, and working to destroy their movements. The conspiracy theory was documented fact, proven through the FBI's own files. COINTELPRO reveals something dark about institutional power. The FBI, an agency tasked with investigating crimes and protecting civil rights, became an active violator of those rights when confronted with dissent it couldn't tolerate. The same agency that was supposed to protect Black Americans from Ku Klux Klan violence worked to destroy Black liberation movements. The same agency that should have been defending First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly was systematically suppressing those rights through illegal covert action. The legacy of COINTELPRO affects us today. Trust between law enforcement and communities of color, between intelligence agencies and civil liberties advocates, was shattered in ways that decades haven't fully repaired. When activists claim government surveillance or infiltration today, they're not being paranoid. They're drawing lessons from documented history. When people express skepticism about official denials of wrongdoing, they're remembering that the FBI denied COINTELPRO's existence right up until stolen documents proved otherwise. In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, presented a proposal to President John F. Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The document they submitted outlined a series of operations designed to create public support for military intervention in Cuba. The plans included hijacking planes, sinking boats, and conducting terrorist attacks against American citizens and military targets. The attacks would be blamed on Cuba, providing justification for invasion. This sounds like the fevered dream of the most paranoid conspiracy theorist. The idea that America's top military leaders would propose killing American citizens in false flag attacks to manufacture consent for war seems too cynical, too evil, too much like something from a dystopian novel. People who suggested the U.S. government might do such things were dismissed as unhinged, as people who'd watched too many movies and lost touch with reality. Except the document was real. Operation Northwoods was a genuine proposal, submitted through official channels, complete with detailed plans for how to execute the attacks and deceive the American public. We know this because the documents were declassified in 1997 as part of the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. You can read them yourself. They're archived, official, and undeniably real. The context matters for understanding how such a proposal could emerge. In 1962, Cold War tensions were at their peak. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 had embarrassed the Kennedy administration and left Cuba's communist government firmly in power under Fidel Castro. The military and intelligence community desperately wanted to remove Castro, viewing Cuba as a communist foothold just 90 miles from American shores. But Kennedy was cautious about direct military intervention, particularly after the Bay of Pigs disaster. The Joint Chiefs needed to create conditions that would force Kennedy's hand. The Northwoods document, titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, was remarkably specific about what it proposed. Let's look at what these senior military officers were willing to do to American citizens in the name of foreign policy objectives. One plan involved creating a pretext by simulating a Cuban attack on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. The document suggested staged incidents including starting fires, sabotaging ammunition, sinking ships in the harbor, and conducting mortar attacks on the base from outside the fence line. These would be self-inflicted wounds, American service members attacking their own base, but the public would be told Cuba was responsible. Another plan proposed a fake, remember the Maine incident. The USS Maine's 1898 explosion in Havana Harbor had triggered the Spanish-American War, and Northwoods suggested repeating this playbook. The military would blow up an unmanned ship in Cuban waters, preferably near Havana or Santiago, creating dramatic explosion footage. They could arrange to have victims appear to be in the water, creating sympathy and outrage. The document notes coldly, casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. The proposal included plans to attack Cuban refugees fleeing to Florida. The military would intercept boats full of real refugees, sink the boats, and either rescue the refugees while blaming Cuba for the attack or, more horrifically, allow some casualties to occur to make the incident more convincing. The document states, "We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized." One of the most shocking proposals involved hijacking aircraft. The plan had two variations. In one, a civilian aircraft would be hijacked by supposed Cuban agents, with passengers potentially killed, to demonstrate Cuban terrorist tactics. In another, an unmanned drone aircraft painted and numbered identically to a legitimate civilian charter would be substituted for the real plane. The real plane would land safely at a military base, while the drone continued toward Cuba. The drone would then broadcast a distress call claiming it was under attack by Cuban MiGs, then be destroyed remotely. To the world, it would appear Cuba had shot down a civilian airliner. The document also proposed staging terrorist campaigns in Miami, other Florida cities, and even Washington, D.C. These would involve bombings, targeting Cuban refugees to create the impression of Cuban sabotage operations. The terror campaign would create an atmosphere of fear and outrage against Cuba, softening public resistance to military intervention. Reading these proposals in the original document is deeply disturbing. The language is bureaucratic, clinical, discussing the murder of American citizens as operational details to be managed. There's discussion of timing to maximize news coverage, consideration of which types of victims would generate the most sympathetic media response, calculation about how to make false flag attacks appear authentic. What's remarkable is that this wasn't some rogue general's fantasy. This was an official proposal that went through military channels and reached the president's desk. It was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer. The Joint Chiefs approved it unanimously. These weren't fringe extremists. They were the military establishment, the men entrusted with defending America, proposing to attack America to justify a war. Kennedy and McNamara rejected Operation Northwoods. Kennedy was reportedly furious. The proposal may have contributed to Kennedy's decision to force Lemnitzer out as chairman of the Joint Chiefs when his term ended later that year. But the fact that the plan was proposed at all, that it was developed seriously, that it received unanimous support from the military's highest leadership, reveals something unsettling about how far institutions are willing to go when they're convinced their objectives are righteous. For decades, people who suggested the government might stage false flag attacks to justify war were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. After all, what government would attack its own people? What military would kill its own citizens? The Northwoods documents proved it wasn't just possible. It was proposed, detailed, and almost implemented. Only presidential rejection prevented it. The declassification of Operation Northwoods in 1997 created surprisingly little public reaction. Perhaps because it emerged alongside thousands of other documents related to Kennedy assassination investigations. But for those paying attention, the implications were staggering. If the Joint Chiefs were willing to propose this in 1962, what other operations might have been proposed before or since? What proposals might have been accepted rather than rejected? Operation Northwoods lends disturbing credibility to questions about other incidents. When governments claim terrorist attacks or provocations justify military action, should we simply accept those claims? Or should we remember that at least once, at the highest levels, American military leadership planned exactly such deceptions, and were only stopped by a president who said no? The document also reveals the military mindset that can develop when institutions become convinced of their righteousness. The Joint Chiefs genuinely believed that removing Castro was crucial for American security. They believed this so strongly that they were willing to sacrifice American lives to achieve it. They had convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, that strategic objectives outweighed ethical constraints, that deception and murder of citizens could be necessary tools of statecraft. This is how conspiracy theories are vindicated, not through speculation or paranoid imagination, but through declassified documents that prove the paranoid scenario was actually discussed, planned, and nearly implemented. Operation Northwoods transformed the question, would the government do that? From rhetorical dismissal to documented answer. Yes, they would, they tried. The year was 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just been inaugurated as president in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks were failing, unemployment had reached 25%, and desperate Americans were questioning whether democracy and capitalism could solve the crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal programs represented aggressive government intervention in the economy, alarming wealthy industrialists and financiers who saw their power and profits threatened. According to Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler, a group of wealthy businessmen approached him with a proposal. They wanted Butler, one of the most decorated and respected military officers in American history, to lead a coup d'etat against Roosevelt. They would finance an organization of veterans, 500,000 strong, who would march on Washington and force Roosevelt to create a new cabinet position, a Secretary of General Affairs, who would hold the real power while Roosevelt remained as a figurehead. If Roosevelt refused to cooperate, he would be removed. The plan was to install a fascist government, similar to those emerging in Italy and Germany, that would protect business interests from Roosevelt's reforms. This sounds absurd. A fascist coup in America, Wall Street tycoons recruiting a general to overthrow a democratically elected president. When Butler reported these allegations to Congress, many dismissed them as the confused ramblings of an aging military man, perhaps suffering from paranoia or seeking attention. Surely this was conspiracy theory at its most ridiculous. Except Butler testified under oath before Congress. A special committee investigated his claims, and while the final story remains murky and contested, there's enough evidence to confirm that something happened, that discussions of a coup took place, and that wealthy Americans at least contemplated overthrowing their own government. Smedley Butler was a fascinating character, which makes his role in this story particularly credible. He was the most decorated Marine in U.S. history at the time of his retirement, twice awarded the Medal of Honor. He'd served in conflicts across Latin America and Asia, enforcing American interests through military force. But by the 1930s, Butler had become disillusioned with how military power served corporate interests. He famously wrote, "I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." This background is crucial. Butler wasn't a naive idealist. He understood power, had wielded it, and knew how institutions operated. He also had no reason to fabricate coup allegations. Doing so would make him look foolish and undermine his reputation. When Butler came forward, he was risking ridicule to expose what he believed was a genuine threat to democracy. According to Butler's testimony, he was first approached by Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman connected to Grayson MP Murphy, a director of Guarantee Trust Company and founder of the American Legion. McGuire initially asked Butler to speak at American Legion conventions, promoting a return to the gold standard. Butler was suspicious of the request, but played along to learn more. Over several meetings, McGuire's proposals became increasingly explicit. He spoke of raising money to finance an organization of veterans. He mentioned meeting with wealthy individuals who were interested in supporting such an organization. He described visiting Europe to study fascist organizations like the Croix de Feu in France and Mussolini's groups in Italy. He eventually told Butler directly that the plan was to organize veterans to pressure Roosevelt, with Butler as their leader. Butler named names. He claimed the conspiracy included some of America's wealthiest and most powerful men. The DuPont family, who controlled the chemical empire, leaders of Goodyear, Standard Oil, and General Motors, and partners from J.P. Morgan. These weren't fringe characters. They were the establishment, the people who ran American industry and finance. Butler reported these conversations to journalist Paul Comlai French, who investigated independently. French met with McGuire, who confirmed many details of Butler's account, including traveling to Europe to study fascist organizations and discussing plans for a veterans organization. French's corroborating testimony strengthened Butler's credibility. In November 1934, the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, chaired by John McCormack and Samuel Dickstein, held hearings on Butler's allegations. Butler testified for hours, providing details of his conversations with McGuire and naming the wealthy backers he'd been told were involved. The committee heard from French as well, who confirmed his investigation. The committee's final report, issued in February 1935, concluded. In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. No evidence was presented, and this committee had none to show a connection between this effort and any fascist activity of any European country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that carefully. The committee concluded that a fascist coup plot had been discussed and planned. They stopped short of saying it would definitely have been executed, but they confirmed that the conspiracy was real, not Butler's imagination. However, the committee faced limitations. The named businessmen denied everything. They had resources to hire lawyers and public relations experts. They controlled newspapers and had political connections. None were subpoenaed to testify, despite Butler's allegations directly naming them. The committee's investigation was cut short when its mandate ended, leaving many questions unanswered. The mainstream press largely buried the story. The New York Times initially covered Butler's testimony, but then published articles questioning his credibility. Other major newspapers either ignored the story or presented it skeptically. This wasn't surprising. These newspapers depended on advertising from the very corporations whose leaders were implicated. The business establishment closed ranks, using their media influence to ensure the story didn't gain traction. So what really happened? The truth likely lies somewhere between Butler's most alarming claims and the complete denials from the accused. It seems clear that discussions about organizing veterans to oppose Roosevelt did occur. McGuire's conversations with Butler and French happened. Too much corroborating detail exists to dismiss them entirely. Whether this constituted a serious coup plot ready for execution, or more exploratory discussions about hypothetical resistance to Roosevelt, remains debatable. But even the exploratory version is damning. The idea that America's wealthiest businessmen discussed, even theoretically, overthrowing democracy because they disliked progressive taxation and labor rights reveals the fragility of democratic norms. These men saw their economic interests as more important than constitutional government. They admired fascist efficiency and control. They were willing to at least contemplate military dictatorship as preferable to a democratically elected president who challenged their power. The business plot also reveals how wealth protects against accountability. Despite congressional findings that a coup plot had been discussed, nobody faced charges. Nobody went to trial. Nobody's reputation suffered permanent damage. The same men Butler accused continued leading major corporations and influencing politics. The conspiracy, even when confirmed by Congress, had no consequences for the conspirators. Butler himself understood what he'd exposed. In his later speeches and writings, he emphasized how economic power could threaten democracy. He argued that business interests had no loyalty to democratic principles when those principles threatened profits. He warned that fascism could come to America not through foreign invasion, but through domestic elites protecting their interests. On October 10, 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl known only as Nayirah testified before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. She described horrific atrocities she'd witnessed after Iraq invaded Kuwait 2 months earlier. Speaking through tears, she told Congress that Iraqi soldiers had stormed into a Kuwaiti hospital where she volunteered. They took babies out of incubators, threw the babies on the cold floor, and took the incubators back to Iraq. 15 babies died, she said, left on the floor to die. The testimony was devastating. It was repeated by President George H.W. Bush, who mentioned the incubator story at least 6 times in the following weeks. 7 U.S. senators cited Nayirah's testimony in their speeches supporting military action against Iraq. The story appeared in newspapers worldwide, generating outrage against Saddam Hussein's regime. The image of soldiers callously murdering helpless infants became a powerful symbol of Iraqi brutality and helped build public support for the Gulf War. There was just one problem: the story was almost entirely fabricated. Nayirah wasn't a simple hospital volunteer. She was Nayirah al-Sabah, daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the United States. Her testimony had been organized and coached by the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton, which was being paid $11 million by the Kuwaiti government to generate American support for military intervention. The incubator story was designed to manipulate American emotions and manufacture consent for war. When skeptics questioned the incubator story, they were dismissed as unpatriotic, as people willing to give a dictator like Saddam Hussein the benefit of the doubt. Surely the testimony of a traumatized girl delivered before Congress must be true. Surely the dozens of public figures repeating the story had verified the facts. Questioning the narrative seemed like conspiracy thinking, like looking for deception where none existed. But the conspiracy theorists were right. The testimony was manufactured propaganda designed to sell a war to the American public by exploiting their emotions and their trust in institutions. The full story of how the Nayirah testimony came to be reveals the sophisticated machinery of modern propaganda. After Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the Kuwaiti government in exile faced a problem. While the invasion violated international law, and the United States had strategic interests in the region, American public support for military intervention was lukewarm. The Vietnam War's legacy made Americans skeptical of foreign military adventures. The Kuwaiti government needed to generate outrage that would overcome this skepticism. They hired Hill and Knowlton, one of the world's largest PR firms, which had extensive experience in crisis management and public opinion shaping. The firm's senior vice president, Laurie Fitzpatrick, had worked in the Reagan White House and understood how to influence Washington. Hill and Knowlton created Citizens for a Free Kuwait, a front group that obscured the Kuwaiti government's role in the campaign. The PR firm organized Nayirah's testimony with remarkable attention to detail. They arranged for her to appear before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, which, despite its official-sounding name, wasn't actually a congressional committee and didn't require witnesses to testify under oath. This meant Nayirah could tell her story without legal penalty for false testimony. Hill and Knowlton coached Nayirah on her testimony, helping her craft a narrative that would maximize emotional impact. They protected her identity, claiming it was to protect her family still in Kuwait, but this also prevented journalists from verifying her story or investigating her background. The caucus co-chair, Tom Lantos, knew Nayirah's true identity but didn't disclose it, allowing her to be presented as an ordinary witness rather than the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador. The incubator story itself had roots in earlier, unverified reports. Amnesty International had issued a report mentioning incubator allegations, though they later retracted it when they couldn't confirm the stories. Hill and Knowlton took these rumored atrocities and packaged them into Nayirah's first-person testimony, giving them the credibility of eyewitness account. After the Gulf War ended in early 1991, journalists began investigating Nayirah's testimony more carefully. John MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine, exposed her true identity and Hill and Knowlton's role in organizing her testimony. ABCS 20/20 investigated and found little evidence supporting the incubator story. Middle East Watch, a human rights organization, investigated and concluded that while Iraqi forces had committed genuine atrocities in Kuwait, the incubator story specifically appeared to be false, or at least greatly exaggerated. The most thorough debunking came from Dr. Mohammed Matter, director of Kuwait's primary care system. After liberation, he told reporters that while Iraqi forces had looted hospitals, he could only confirm one premature baby dying after an incubator was taken. The image of 15 babies left to die on cold floors never happened. Some incubators were stolen, and hospital services were disrupted, but the specific horror Nayirah described was fabrication designed for maximum emotional impact. Hill and Knowlton defended their work, arguing they'd simply helped a traumatized girl tell her story. But internal documents revealed the extent of their orchestration. They'd organized the congressional appearance, coordinated media coverage, and helped distribute Nayirah's testimony through news outlets. They'd created a propaganda campaign masquerading as grassroots concern and authentic testimony. The impact of the false testimony is hard to measure precisely, but it clearly influenced public opinion. Polls showed American support for military action increased after the incubator story spread. Senators who supported the war resolution cited the testimony in their speeches. The narrative of Iraqi soldiers as baby killers made Saddam Hussein's regime seem uniquely evil, worthy of military intervention despite America's general post-Vietnam reluctance for foreign wars. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how many institutions failed. Congress provided a platform for the testimony without basic verification. The media repeated the story without adequately investigating its source. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International published reports based on unreliable information. Government officials used the story to justify war without confirming its accuracy. Every institution that should have demanded evidence, instead, accepted an emotionally powerful narrative. The Nayirah testimony wasn't the only reason for the Gulf War. Genuine strategic interests were at stake. Iraq's control of Kuwait threatened oil supplies and regional stability. But the fabricated testimony shaped public opinion in ways that genuine strategic arguments couldn't. It made the war feel morally necessary rather than merely strategically advisable. It transformed military action from cold calculation about national interests into a righteous rescue of innocents from monsters. This manipulation has had lasting effects on public trust. When governments claim humanitarian reasons for military intervention, when emotional testimonies drive policy decisions, when we're told we must act to prevent atrocities, people remember Nayirah. They remember being manipulated by a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign. They become skeptical of even genuine humanitarian concerns because they've been deceived before. In the 1970s, investigative journalists and congressional investigators began uncovering something that would shake American faith in media independence. For decades, the CIA had been secretly recruiting journalists, funding media outlets, and planting stories in American and foreign publications. The program, eventually dubbed Operation Mockingbird, represented a massive infiltration of supposedly free press by intelligence services. When critics claimed the CIA was controlling media narratives, planting propaganda in American newspapers, and recruiting journalists as intelligence assets, they were dismissed as paranoid anti-government extremists. After all, America had a free press protected by the First Amendment. The idea that trusted journalists and respected publications might be intelligence operatives or CIA fronts seemed like the fantasy of people who couldn't accept that news organizations simply reported facts. But the conspiracy theorists were right. The CIA had indeed created an extensive network of media relationships, recruiting journalists, funding publications, and using American media as a tool for psychological warfare and propaganda dissemination. Operation Mockingbird was real, and it compromised the independence of American journalism for decades. The program's origins trace back to the late 1940s, as the Cold War intensified, and the CIA sought ways to influence public opinion both domestically and abroad. Frank Wisner, who headed the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, began recruiting journalists and media executives who would be friendly to CIA interests. The initial goal was fighting communist propaganda, but the program quickly expanded beyond foreign operations. By the 1950s, the CIA had relationships with over 400 journalists and media figures. These weren't just freelancers or stringers. They included reporters from major news organizations, editors at respected newspapers, and even owners of media companies. Some relationships were formalized, with journalists essentially working for the CIA while maintaining their media cover. Others were more casual, with journalists occasionally providing information or agreeing to publish stories provided by intelligence sources. The CIA's media operations took several forms. They funded publications that appeared independent but were actually intelligence fronts. They planted stories in foreign newspapers that would then be picked up by American media, allowing propaganda to enter domestic news coverage through the back door. They provided journalists with exclusive information and access in exchange for favorable coverage or willingness to publish CIA-generated content. They recruited student journalists and groomed them for careers in media where they could later serve intelligence interests. One of the most significant CIA media assets was Cord Mayor Jr., who ran the International Organizations Division. Mayer oversaw funding for dozens of international organizations, many of which published magazines and books. Through front organizations, the CIA funded intellectual magazines, cultural organizations, and publishing houses across Europe and the United States. Writers and editors often had no idea their funding came from intelligence services. The CIA also had close relationships with major American news organizations. The New York Times, CBS, Time magazine, and other respected outlets had journalists who cooperated with the agency. Some of these journalists genuinely believed they were serving American interests by helping with intelligence gathering. Others were simply flattered by access to classified information and high-level sources. Some were compensated. Others provided assistance out of patriotic duty. The extent of media manipulation became public through several revelations. In 1967, Ramparts magazine exposed CIA funding of the National Student Association, revealing that an organization presented as independent was actually an intelligence front. This led to broader investigations of CIA domestic operations. The most extensive revelations came from the Church Committee investigations in 1975. The committee discovered that the CIA had relationships with numerous journalists and had used these relationships to plant stories, gather intelligence, and manipulate public opinion. The committee's final report stated, "The CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA, and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets." Carl Bernstein, famous for investigating Watergate, wrote a detailed exposé about the CIA and the media in Rolling Stone magazine in 1977. His reporting revealed that at least 400 journalists had secretly carried out assignments for the CIA over the previous 25 years. He documented how the CIA had paid journalists to plant stories, how it had used cover positions at news organizations for intelligence officers, and how deeply the agency had penetrated American media. The CIA's relationship with CBS was particularly close. CBS President William Paley and CIA Director Allen Dulles were personal friends, and this relationship facilitated CIA use of CBS resources. CIA officers used CBS cover for intelligence operations. The agency had relationships with CBS correspondents and could request story placements or suppression. Similar relationships existed at other networks and publications. One documented example of CIA media manipulation involved the agency's campaign against Chilean President Salvador Allende. The CIA funded opposition newspapers in Chile, planted anti-Allende stories in Chilean media, and ensured these stories reached American audiences through cooperative journalists. The campaign helped create the political conditions for the 1973 coup that overthrew Allende and installed Augusto Pinochet's military dictatorship. The CIA also used media relationships to suppress stories it didn't want published. When journalists stumbled onto sensitive intelligence operations, the agency could call in favors to kill stories or water down their impact. This meant that even journalists who weren't actively working for the CIA could be influenced by it through editorial pressure from higher-ups who had agency relationships. After the Church Committee revelations, CIA Director George H.W. Bush issued guidelines limiting the agency's use of journalists. The official policy became that the CIA would not have paid or contractual relationships with accredited American journalists. But loopholes existed. The policy didn't cover stringers, freelancers, or foreign journalists. It didn't prevent CIA officers from posing as journalists, and it relied on the agency policing itself with little external oversight. Questions remain about whether the practices truly ended or simply became more covert. When the CIA wants a story planted or suppressed today, do those old relationships and networks still exist? Have they been replaced by more sophisticated methods? The agency's history of media manipulation makes it difficult to trust official denials. Operation Mockingbird's exposure fundamentally changed how Americans view their news media. The revelation that respected journalists and trusted publications had been secretly serving intelligence interests shattered assumptions about press independence. Even today, when intelligence officials are quoted as anonymous sources in major news stories, some wonder whether we're seeing journalism or managed propaganda. The program also raises questions about how free speech and press freedom can coexist with powerful intelligence agencies. If the CIA can recruit journalists, fund publications, and plant stories, is the press really free? Or is it free only to the extent that its coverage aligns with intelligence interests? When media owners and editors have relationships with intelligence services, how can readers know what they're reading is independent journalism rather than approved narrative? On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer conducting intelligence operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, on August 4, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack. The ship's radar showed what appeared to be enemy vessels, and sonar operators reported hearing torpedo sounds. The commanders believed they were under sustained attack in international waters. President Lyndon B. Johnson went on national television to announce the attacks and to declare that America would respond with force. He told the American people that North Vietnamese forces had conducted unprovoked attacks on U.S. vessels in international waters. Congress, outraged by this apparent aggression, passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with near-unanimous support. Only 2 senators voted against it. The resolution gave Johnson authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It became the legal foundation for America's massive escalation in Vietnam, a war that would eventually kill over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. There was just one problem. The second attack, the one that triggered the resolution and the war escalation, never happened. It was a phantom, a combination of faulty equipment, bad weather, nervous operators, and possibly deliberate misrepresentation. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the trigger for America's deepest involvement in Vietnam, was based on false information that government officials knew was questionable at the time, but presented as certain fact. When critics questioned the official story, when they suggested the attacks might not have occurred as described, or that the U.S. had provoked the incidents, they were dismissed as unpatriotic, as people willing to side with communist aggressors over American service members. To question the Gulf of Tonkin incident was to question the entire justification for the Vietnam War. Surely the government wouldn't lie about something this consequential. Surely the president wouldn't mislead Congress and the American people into a war based on false information. But that's exactly what happened, and we know this because the government's own documents, declassified decades later, prove it. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the Gulf of Tonkin incident was exaggerated or fabricated to justify war were completely right. Let's understand what actually happened, as opposed to what the American public was told. The first attack on August 2 did occur, though the context matters. The USS Maddox wasn't simply cruising in international waters, minding its own business. It was conducting DESOTO patrol operations, intelligence-gathering missions that involved coming very close to North Vietnamese territory and monitoring their military communications and radar installations. The Maddox had been supporting South Vietnamese commando raids against North Vietnamese coastal installations, providing intelligence and coordination. When North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached the Maddox on August 2, they had reason to believe the ship was involved in the attacks on their territory. Because it was. The Maddox fired warning shots, the torpedo boats attacked, and U.S. aircraft from the carrier Ticonderoga arrived to drive them off. One torpedo boat was damaged, and the others retreated. The Maddox sustained no damage and no casualties. It was a brief skirmish in waters where tensions were already high, provoked at least in part by American intelligence operations. Then came August 4, the second reported attack. The Maddox and Turner Joy were operating in bad weather, with rough seas and poor visibility. Both ships' radar showed what appeared to be enemy vessels. Sonar operators reported hearing torpedo noises. The ships maneuvered and fired at radar contacts for several hours, reporting themselves under sustained attack. But as the night went on, doubt crept in. James Stockdale, a Navy pilot flying overhead during the supposed attack, saw no enemy vessels and no weapons fire except from the American destroyers. He later said, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." The Maddox's commander, John Herrick, sent a cable just hours after the incident expressing doubt about what had happened. He wrote, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." This cable reached Washington while Johnson and his advisors were deciding how to respond. They knew within hours that the second attack was questionable. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara spoke with military commanders who expressed uncertainty. Yet Johnson decided to proceed with the narrative that American ships had been attacked unprovoked, and McNamara presented Congress with certainty where doubt existed. Johnson went on television and told the American people, "Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight." He ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 3 days later, giving Johnson essentially unlimited authority to wage war in Vietnam. The resolution stated that Congress approves and supports the determination of the President, as Commander-in-Chief, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was a blank check for war written based on an attack that probably didn't happen. Some members of Congress had doubts. Senator Wayne Morse, one of only 2 senators to vote against the resolution, questioned the official narrative and suggested the U.S. had provoked the incidents. He was largely ignored. The political climate made opposition seem unpatriotic. Most of Congress trusted that the president and military had accurately reported what happened. They assumed the evidence was clear and compelling. For years, the official story held. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was presented as unprovoked North Vietnamese aggression, as clear casus belli that justified American military response. Those who questioned this narrative were marginalized as anti-war radicals or conspiracy theorists. But the truth leaked out gradually. In 1968, Senate hearings revealed some of the doubts that had existed about the second attack. McNamara admitted under questioning that the evidence wasn't as certain as publicly presented, though he maintained the attacks had occurred. More details emerged through investigative journalism in the 1970s. Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, contained documents showing that administration officials knew the second attack was doubtful. The most comprehensive revelation came in 2005, when the National Security Agency declassified documents about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. These documents, including internal NSA analyses, concluded that no attack occurred on August 4, 1964. The NSA historian who reviewed the incident wrote that the intelligence had been deliberately skewed to support the narrative of an attack, that evidence contradicting the attack had been suppressed, and that the Johnson administration had used questionable intelligence to justify escalating the war. The declassified documents revealed something even more troubling. The Maddox's DESOTO patrol operations had been deliberately provocative, designed to elicit North Vietnamese response that could justify American military action. The plan was called graduated pressure, and it involved incrementally escalating provocations to create conditions for war. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, whether the second attack was real or imagined, fit perfectly into this strategy. Robert McNamara, in his later years, admitted the truth. In his 1995 memoir and the 2003 documentary, The Fog of War, he acknowledged that the second attack probably didn't occur, that the administration had been too quick to interpret uncertain intelligence as definite fact, and that Congress had been misled. He expressed regret, but also attempted to contextualize the decisions within Cold War thinking and genuine belief that communist expansion had to be stopped. But McNamara's regrets came decades too late for the millions affected by the war. Over 58,000 American service members died in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians were killed. Entire regions were devastated. The war cost hundreds of billions of dollars, divided American society, and created lasting trauma for everyone involved. All of this was justified initially by an incident that didn't happen. The Gulf of Tonkin incident teaches several lessons about how governments manufacture consent for war. First, it shows how uncertain intelligence can be presented as absolute fact when there's political will for military action. The doubts about the second attack were known immediately, but they were suppressed in favor of a clearer narrative that supported the desired policy. Second, it demonstrates the danger of blank check war authorizations. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave the president essentially unlimited power to wage war without further congressional approval. This concentration of power in the executive branch, granted in a moment of perceived crisis based on false information, enabled years of war that Congress might not have approved if asked to vote on sustained military action. Third, the incident reveals how difficult it is to correct false narratives once they're established. Even after doubts emerged, even after evidence accumulated that the second attack was phantom, the basic narrative, North Vietnamese aggression requiring American response, remained dominant for years. Political leaders who'd supported the war based on Gulf of Tonkin had incentives to maintain the official story rather than admit they'd been misled. The conspiracy theorists who claimed the Gulf of Tonkin incident was exaggerated or fabricated to justify war were vindicated by the government's own declassified documents. The paranoid suspicion that administrations manipulate intelligence and manufacture incidents to support predetermined policies wasn't paranoia. It was accurate understanding of what actually happened. The phantom attack was real only in the sense that it really was used to start a war, even though the attack itself never occurred. In the 1950s and 60s, if you suggested that cigarette companies knew their products caused cancer and were deliberately hiding this information while marketing cigarettes as safe, you'd be dismissed as an anti-business alarmist. After all, tobacco companies employed scientists, published research, and advertised in medical journals. Doctors appeared in cigarette advertisements recommending particular brands. Tobacco executives testified before Congress that they didn't believe cigarettes caused cancer. Surely these respectable companies and medical professionals wouldn't lie about something that affected millions of lives. Except they were lying. For decades, the tobacco industry knew that cigarettes caused cancer, heart disease, and other serious health problems. They conducted their own research proving the connection, then suppressed it. They hired scientists to publish studies casting doubt on the health risks. They orchestrated coordinated campaigns to deceive the public, manipulate science, and deny knowledge they possessed. It was one of history's most cynical and deadly corporate conspiracies. And we know every detail because internal documents were eventually released through litigation. The conspiracy theory was simple. Tobacco companies knew cigarettes killed people but kept selling them anyway, lying to the public and even to smokers dying of lung cancer. The truth turned out to be worse than the theory. Not only did tobacco companies know about the health risks, they actively worked to create doubt and confusion to prevent effective regulation and maintain profits. The story begins in the 1950s, when scientific evidence connecting smoking to lung cancer began accumulating. In 1950, landmark studies by Ernst Winder and Avarts Graham in the US and Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill in the UK demonstrated strong statistical connections between smoking and lung cancer. These studies used careful methodology and large sample sizes. The evidence was compelling. Tobacco companies faced a crisis. Smoking rates were high. Roughly half of American adults smoked, but if the health risks became widely accepted, demand might collapse. The industry's response wasn't to make safer products or help smokers quit. It was to manufacture doubt about the science and fight regulation at every turn. In December 1953, tobacco company executives met in New York at the Plaza Hotel with John Hill, head of the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. This meeting produced a strategy that would guide tobacco industry behavior for decades. Rather than acknowledge health risks and work on solutions, the industry would dispute the science, fund friendly researchers, and create the impression of scientific controversy where growing consensus actually existed. The result was the frank statement to cigarette smokers, published in January 1954 in over 400 newspapers across America. The statement expressed concern about the health studies, promised to support research, and implied that the science was uncertain and contradictory. It stated, "We believe the products we make are not injurious to health. We always have and always will cooperate closely with those whose task it is to safeguard the public health." This was a lie. Internal tobacco company documents, released decades later through litigation, proved the industry already knew cigarettes caused cancer. Scientists working for tobacco companies had conducted animal studies proving tobacco caused tumors. Industry chemists had identified carcinogens in cigarette smoke. The companies knew their products killed people, but they were making too much money to care. The frank statement also announced creation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research. This sounds like a genuine research organization, but it was actually a public relations front designed to create the appearance of scientific inquiry, while actually working to suppress damaging research and promote industry-friendly studies. The council funded research, but with strings attached. Studies that might reveal health hazards were discouraged or defunded. Researchers who produced results unfavorable to the industry found their funding cut. Meanwhile, the council promoted any study that could be used to cast doubt on the smoking cancer connection, no matter how poorly designed or marginal the research. Tobacco companies also funded individual scientists who would testify as expert witnesses, publish articles questioning the health consensus, and serve as consultants. These scientists for hire lent academic credibility to tobacco industry positions. Some genuinely believed their positions, having convinced themselves the science was uncertain. Others knew they were providing cover for deadly products, but rationalized it as legitimate scientific skepticism. The industry's strategy was summarized in a famous 1969 internal memo from a Brown and Williamson executive. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. Read that again. The tobacco industry explicitly sought to create doubt and controversy about science that was increasingly settled. They didn't need to prove cigarettes were safe. They just needed to prevent the public from believing they were dangerous. As long as doubt existed, smokers would keep smoking and new smokers would start. This strategy worked devastatingly well. Despite mounting scientific evidence, effective regulation was delayed for decades. Cigarette advertising continued unrestricted through the 1960s. Warning labels, when finally mandated, were weak and easily dismissed. Tobacco companies fought every regulatory attempt, using their doubt manufacturing infrastructure to claim the science was uncertain and regulation premature. Internal documents revealed the extent of the deception. A 1963 memo from an R.J. Reynolds scientist stated, "We are, then, in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug effective in the release of stress mechanisms." The industry knew cigarettes were addictive decades before publicly admitting it. They understood they were selling addiction, not just tobacco. Documents also showed tobacco companies manipulated nicotine levels to maintain addiction. They studied how to make cigarettes more addictive, how to hook young smokers, and how to make it harder for smokers to quit. These weren't accidental effects. They were deliberate design choices made to maximize addiction and profit. The youth market was particularly cynical. Internal documents revealed campaigns specifically targeting teenagers, despite public statements that the industry didn't want minors smoking. The Joe Camel campaign, for example, dramatically increased Camel's market share among underage smokers. R.J. Reynolds knew this, internal documents proved it, but they continued the campaign for years. The truth began emerging through litigation in the 1990s. As lawsuits from dying smokers and states seeking to recover health care costs multiplied, tobacco companies were forced to produce internal documents. The documents revealed everything: the early knowledge of health risks, the decision to deny and deceive, the deliberate marketing to children, the manipulation of nicotine levels, and the coordinated campaigns to manufacture scientific doubt. In 1998, tobacco companies reached the Master Settlement Agreement with 46 states, paying $206 billion over 25 years to compensate for smoking-related health care costs. The agreement also required tobacco companies to release millions of internal documents, creating a vast archive of corporate malfeasance. These documents proved every accusation the conspiracy theorists had made. Yes, tobacco companies knew cigarettes caused cancer and lied about it. Yes, they deliberately marketed to children while claiming they didn't. Yes, they manipulated nicotine to maintain addiction. Yes, they funded scientists to create false scientific controversy. Every paranoid suspicion about big tobacco turned out to be documented fact. The human cost of this deception is staggering. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that cigarettes kill over 480,000 Americans every year. More than alcohol, car accidents, illegal drugs, murders, and suicides combined. Globally, tobacco kills over 8 million people annually. Many of these deaths occurred during the decades when tobacco companies were denying health risks they knew to be real. The tobacco industry's tactics have become a playbook for other industries facing scientific evidence of harm. The fossil fuel industry's response to climate science closely mirrors tobacco's response to cancer science. Manufacture doubt, fund contrary research, dispute settled science, delay regulation. The same PR firms, the same hired scientists, the same strategies have been deployed again. The tobacco case also demonstrates how corporate profit motive can override ethical constraints when accountability is lacking. Tobacco executives made calculated decisions to prioritize shareholder returns over public health. They knew their products killed people. They sold them anyway. They fought regulation that might save lives because it would reduce profits. This wasn't ignorance or mistake. It was knowing, deliberate choice. When tobacco executives testified before Congress in 1994, they all stated under oath that they didn't believe nicotine was addictive. This was perjury. Internal documents proved they knew nicotine was addictive. They'd studied it extensively. They'd manipulated it deliberately. But they lied to Congress because admitting addiction would invite regulation and liability. The conspiracy theorists who claimed big tobacco was lying about health risks, who suspected cigarette companies were more concerned with profits than lives, who believed the industry was deliberately deceiving the public about deadly products. They were completely, documentedly right. The paranoid vision of corporate conspiracy to profit from death wasn't paranoia. It was accurate reporting of what internal documents later proved. For years, privacy advocates, technology experts, and civil libertarians warned that the U.S. government was conducting mass surveillance of American communications. They suggested that the National Security Agency was collecting vast amounts of data on phone calls, emails, and internet activity, sweeping up information on millions of Americans who'd never been suspected of any crime. They warned that the infrastructure of digital communication was being exploited for unprecedented surveillance. They were dismissed as paranoid. Government officials insisted that intelligence agencies operated under strict legal constraints, that they only targeted foreign threats, that Americans' privacy was protected by law and oversight. When the New York Times reported in 2005 that the NSA was conducting warrantless wiretapping, the Bush administration insisted the program was limited and legal. Surely the fears of mass surveillance were exaggerations, the fevered imaginations of people who watched too many spy movies. Then, in June 2013, Edward Snowden, a 29-year-old contractor working for the NSA, released thousands of classified documents to journalists. The documents proved that everything the paranoid privacy advocates had warned about was actually happening. And the reality was more invasive than even the most suspicious critics had imagined. The NSA, along with its international partners, had built a surveillance infrastructure that captured and stored communications on a massive scale, without individualized warrants, affecting virtually everyone who used modern telecommunications. The conspiracy theory was vindicated so thoroughly that the primary debate became not whether mass surveillance existed, but whether it was justified. The government stopped denying the programs and started defending them. The documents Snowden released revealed multiple NSA programs, each representing different aspects of mass surveillance. Let's understand what was actually happening, as opposed to what the public had been told. The PRISM program gave the NSA direct access to servers of major internet companies, including Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Yahoo. The NSA could collect emails, chat logs, photos, and other user data from these companies. While the companies initially denied giving direct access, documents suggested extensive cooperation between Silicon Valley and intelligence agencies. The NSA's bulk telephone metadata collection program, conducted under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, collected records of virtually every phone call made in the United States. The program didn't record conversation content, but captured who called whom, when, and for how long. This metadata, collected on hundreds of millions of Americans regardless of any suspicion, created a map of social relationships and communication patterns. The NSA tapped directly into fiber optic cables carrying internet traffic, collecting vast amounts of data as it flowed across networks. Programs like Upstream intercepted communications at choke points where internet traffic could be bulk collected. This wasn't targeted surveillance of specific suspects. It was massive data collection of entire communication streams. The NSA had also compromised encryption standards, worked with technology companies to build backdoors into security systems, and developed tools to hack into computers and phones. They'd weakened internet security globally to ensure they could break encryption when desired, making everyone's communications less secure. International partnerships extended surveillance reach. The Five Eyes Alliance, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, shared intelligence and conducted surveillance that each country might not legally be able to conduct on its own citizens. If American law prevented the NSA from spying on Americans, British intelligence could do it and share the results, effectively circumventing legal protections. The scope was staggering. Documents revealed the NSA was collecting billions of communications records daily. They'd intercepted communications of foreign leaders, including allied countries. They'd collected data on Americans' internet searches, email contacts, and browsing habits. They'd created enormous databases of information collected without individualized warrants or specific suspicion. Government officials initially denied specific programs, then admitted their existence, but insisted they were legal and necessary. President Obama defended the programs as critical for preventing terrorism, claiming robust oversight existed and that privacy protections were in place. Intelligence community leaders testified to Congress that the programs had prevented terrorist attacks, though specific claims often couldn't be verified. The legal justification for these programs relied on broad interpretations of existing laws. Section 215 of the Patriot Act allowed collection of records relevant to terrorism investigations. The NSA interpreted this to mean they could collect all phone records, since any might potentially be relevant. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, authorized surveillance of foreign targets, but the NSA interpreted this to allow bulk collection of communications that might involve foreign persons. These interpretations stretched laws far beyond what Congress intended. When the Patriot Act was debated, members of Congress didn't understand they were authorizing bulk collection of all Americans' phone records. The secret FISA court issued opinions blessing these programs, but these legal interpretations remained classified. Americans were subject to surveillance authorized by secret court opinions interpreting laws in ways that would have shocked the legislators who wrote them. Snowden's revelations triggered massive public debate. Some viewed him as a whistleblower who'd exposed unconstitutional government overreach. Others considered him a traitor who'd revealed legitimate intelligence programs and endangered national security. The debate revealed deep divisions about privacy, security, and government power in the digital age. The revelations had practical consequences. Technology companies, embarrassed by their cooperation with surveillance programs, began implementing stronger encryption. International relationships were damaged when Allied leaders discovered their communications had been intercepted. Reform efforts led to modest changes in surveillance authorities, though critics argued the reforms were superficial. The USA Freedom Act, passed in 2015, ended the NSA's bulk collection of phone records, requiring them to obtain specific records from phone companies with FISA court approval. But critics noted that this change affected only one program among many, and that much of the surveillance infrastructure remained intact. What made Snowden's revelations so significant wasn't just the specific programs exposed, but the confirmation that the worst fears of privacy advocates were justified. The paranoid vision of a surveillance state collecting information on everyone, just in case it might someday be useful, wasn't paranoid. It was accurate description of programs that actually existed, funded with billions of dollars and blessed by secret court opinions. The surveillance revelations also demonstrated how classification can hide unconstitutional behavior. Everything Snowden revealed was classified, meaning the programs operated in complete secrecy. The public couldn't debate policies they didn't know existed. Congress couldn't effectively oversee programs whose details were hidden even from most legislators. Courts couldn't challenge the constitutionality of searches that were conducted in secret. Classification created a system where government could violate the Fourth Amendment on a massive scale without meaningful accountability. The NSA mass surveillance represents perhaps the perfect vindication of conspiracy theorists. Everything privacy advocates warned about was happening. The technological infrastructure of modern communication really was being exploited for unprecedented surveillance. The government really was collecting data on millions of innocent people. Intelligence agencies really were operating with minimal oversight and maximal secrecy. The paranoid fears weren't paranoid. They were accurate assessments, later confirmed by classified documents. Snowden himself paid an enormous price for revealing the truth. Charged with espionage, he fled the United States and eventually received asylum in Russia, unable to return home without facing decades in prison. Whether he's a hero or traitor remains disputed, but his revelations unquestionably proved that the surveillance state critics had warned about was real. The mass surveillance revelations force uncomfortable questions that persist today. How much surveillance should governments conduct in the name of security? What oversight is sufficient? How do we balance privacy and security in an age when digital surveillance is technically feasible on unprecedented scales? And crucially, can we trust institutions that have demonstrated willingness to exceed legal authority and hide unconstitutional behavior behind classification? Tonight, we've journeyed through 10 of history's most disturbing vindications of conspiracy thinking. From MKUltra's mind control experiments to the NSA's mass surveillance programs, from tobacco companies' deadly deceptions to the Gulf of Tonkin's phantom attack, we've seen how seemingly paranoid theories turned out to be documented fact. These stories share a troubling pattern. Powerful institutions lying to the public, operating in secret, prioritizing their interests over truth, and dismissing critics as conspiracy theorists right up until the moment when evidence proved those critics completely right. Thank you for joining me on this journey through conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you question wisely, trust carefully, and remember that healthy skepticism isn't paranoia. Sometimes it's just paying attention.